Hello everyone, welcome to the Students for Liberty webinar from our series basically of Stay Home, Spread Liberty. So we are so excited today to have Viscount Matt Ridley, Dr. Ridley, who is releasing his brand new fantastic book, How Innovation Works, which is an authoritative account of how basically humans have managed to create and entrepreneurialize and just generate so much wealth, health and happiness across the world, and what that means for us nowadays. Just some general background about Students for Liberty. We're a 501c educational charity based in the US, but we have branches all over the world. We're here as a student-led organization to basically allow liberty-loving students across the world to meet, talk, collaborate, and help each other spread liberty on campuses, you know, from London to Timbuktu to Washington, or everywhere. So I myself am Max Marlowe. I'm the president of the Hayek Society at the London School of Economics. I've just entered my second term, which is fantastic. So more stuff to come. And I've been working with Students for Liberty since about September 2018, I believe. So I've been doing this for a while, and it's so great to have Viscount Ridley here, who's going to be talking to us for, I believe, about 40 minutes about innovation, coronavirus, just, you know, really great pertinent stuff. And if anyone has any questions, please put it into the Q&A box, and we'll also be monitoring stuff on Facebook. And I would now like to pass the floor over to Viscount Ridley, a prolific science writer, journalist, and all-round sound guy. So Viscount Ridley, please, welcome.
Well, thank you, Max, very much indeed. It's great to be with you. I think you're doing a fantastic job in Students for Liberty. It's a wonderful organization, and it's kind of ridiculous that it has to exist. I thought we were all for liberty, but it does seem to be a battle that needs to be fought and refought regularly. And I hope that this new book I've written, as well as some of the other ones, can be helpful in that. And I would love to share some of the thoughts in it. It's not about liberty per se, but it is about innovation. And my argument is that innovation flourishes in freedom, that it is one of the key ingredients to making innovation happen, and the benefits that come from it is to be able to try new things, experiment with new things, meet new people, travel to new places, all the things that come with city-states in the certain times of history, and not with empires and repressive regimes generally. What I'd like to do is share some slides, and just because they're more interesting than looking at a picture of me and my bookcase. And that will jog my memory to mention various things as we're going through. So I'll rattle along for 30, 40 minutes and then take some questions at the end of that, if that's all right. It now says that host has disabled screen sharing. So I need you to enable screen sharing, somebody, if you could kindly do that. I ain't the host, so I can't do it myself. Any idea how that happens? Anybody?
I believe that's over to Andreas.
Yes,
who,
I'm fixing that right now. Sorry.
But I'm going to start by talking about innovation in the wake of the pandemic. To say in the wake of might be a little premature, but I think there is reason to think that. Yeah. I guess you're seeing. What are you seeing now? Presenter view.
Yes, we can see the slides,
so
and
you can see what's coming next. But that,
yes,
I don't
absolutely.
mind that. It's quite a good way of seeing it, I guess. I think we will get through this pandemic. I think whether we get through it with our liberty intact is a considerable concern. I think there are issues about how much governments are enjoying and people are enjoying telling each other what to do that we have to address. And that's going to be a fight that we're all going to have to help with. As I say, I think the worst is over. We are fortunate in not seeing a huge pandemic develop in India and Africa and places like that. Brazil is a concern, but Europe and North America are where this is mostly happening, and a lot of it is a hospital-acquired and care home-acquired pandemic. And if we can defeat this either with vaccination or with antivirals, or indeed with electronics, with digital technologies like test, track, and trace, then we can get back to building a better world for everybody. It is a brutal episode, but it is one that I'm sure we can get through as a civilization. Well, I'm going to rattle through some of the essentials that I think are features of how innovation works. And I arrive at these conclusions empirically. That is to say, I wrote a book with 30 or 40 different stories in it about how different technologies, from steam engines to search engines, came into existence. And I tried to draw general lessons from them in some of the later chapters of the book. So you could read it just as a series of interesting stories, if you like, or you could read it as a book with an argument. They're both there. I'm going to make the case that innovation is more gradual than we tend to think it is, much less sudden, much less step changing, much less disruptive, that it is a serendipitous thing where quite often you set out to invent one thing and you end up inventing something completely different, that it is recombinant, it tends to combine existing technologies rather than develop whole brand new ones from nothing, that it is quite different from invention, which is the process of coming up with a prototype. Innovation is the process of turning a prototype into something useful, practical, and affordable, and that is a lot of work. That it works hugely on trial and error, that the most important mechanism for developing an innovation is trial and error. It's a team sport. It's not an individual pursuit, that people need to rely on the work of other people all the time, whether they're predecessors or their successors or their collaborators at the time. It's inexorable. Once it starts, it has a sort of inevitability about it, about what comes next. It's characterized by what I call a hype cycle, where we underestimate its impact in the long run, but we overestimate it in the short run. So we have to get through a period when innovation is disappointing before we can get to the point where innovation is exciting. It loves fragmented governance. It likes continents or countries that are split up into different polities. It doesn't work very well in empires or in big companies. It's an evolutionary phenomenon in the sense that it works through natural selection and produces spontaneous order. It is the seed of science just as much as it is the fruit of science. So it's a mistake to think of science as upstream of innovation all the time. It sometimes is, sometimes it's not. It creates jobs rather than destroys them on net, and always will. It produces more from less. That is to say, it enables us to use less land, less water, less metal, less inputs generally in order to produce a given output, less silicon for the same amount of computing power, for example. And that, for that reason, it is potentially infinite, because it's not about using more resources. And above all, as I say, it flourishes in freedom. So innovation is gradual. This is a chart of Moore's law, and you can see in it the extraordinary steady improvement in the price and availability of computing over time. And you can see something also rather strange, which is that when we jumped from the vacuum tube to the transistor, and then from the transistor to the integrated circuit, there is no step change in the process. And indeed, Gordon Moore discovered the Moore's law in the 1960s. But did it result in us being able to cheat Moore's law and to jump ahead? No, it didn't. Moore's law continued at roughly the same rate. So there's an incremental thing about innovation. Each technology leads to a possibility for the next technology. I was thinking, for some reason, in the shower this morning, that I don't know why I was thinking this, but that the chainsaw and the lawnmower became inevitable once the motor car had been invented. Once you've invented petrol motors to run things that turn round, you're going to invent all those kind of things gradually, but not in one go. It's serendipitous. When Art Fry developed the Post-it note, what he was doing was taking a failed project at 3M, which was to find a strong and permanent glue for paper, and turn it into a better idea, which was a temporary glue for paper. And he suddenly realized that this failure was actually a success, because he could use it to mark his place in his hymn book when he was in choir practice. Likewise, Stephanie Kwolek at DuPont invented Kevlar when she was looking for something completely different. This story is common in the story of innovation. It is recombinant, by which I mean every technology is a combination of other technologies, and it comes about when two technologies meet and mate and have a new technology. My favorite example of this, and some people may have heard me talk about this before, is the pill camera, which takes a picture of your insides. And it came about after a conversation over a garden fence between a gastroenterologist and a guided missile designer. That's a good example of ideas having sex. Now, as I said in The Rational Optimist, there is an object that sits on my desk at home, which is an Australian hand axe. This is a picture of it. And next to it sits an object of exactly the same size and shape. And I suddenly saw this one day and I thought, how fascinating, both designed to fit the human hand, even though one is 500,000 years old and the other is just a year or two old. And yet it's the differences between them rather than the similarity that is most striking, because the object on the left is made from one substance, whereas the object from the right is made from different substances, plastic, metal, silicon, and different ideas, the idea of computing, the idea of the mouse, and so on. Ideas that occur to different people in different times and different places, but are combined in this one object. And I'm sort of making the argument that Leonard Read made in his famous essay, I, Pencil, about how a pencil came into the world. And the pencil concludes that it came about as a result of the collaboration of millions of individuals who are growing trees and chopping them down, who are mining graphite, who are building pencil factories, etc., etc. They were all combining their efforts to make this one object. But the weird thing was that not one of them knew how to make a pencil. There is nobody on the planet who knows that. It is not held in individual minds, it's held between minds, it's held in the cloud. And that's true of almost every object we see. So the process of innovation requires exchange. It requires the combination of ideas, and that comes about because of the human habit of trade, the human habit of swapping one thing for another. And this is human. It's peculiar. It is not found in other animals. I can get into that argument if you like, but basically only human beings experience this strange phenomenon of swapping things for mutual benefit. No man ever saw a dog make fair and deliberate exchange of a bone with another dog, said Adam Smith. Now, another feature of innovation is that it's quite different from invention. Charles Townes, the inventor of the laser, was fond of telling this story about the beaver and the rabbit standing looking at the Hoover Dam. No, says the beaver, I didn't build it, but it's based on an idea of mine. Well, it's true that inventors invent prototypes and that many years down the line, they see their ideas being used in fantastically complicated, sophisticated, and affordable machines. And they sometimes think that's a bit unfair. I invented that. But actually, innovation is the process of turning something into a practical or scaled up invention. And it ain't nearly as easy as it looks. And the innovator deserves credit as well as the inventor. Or as Joseph Schumpeter put it back in the 1930s, the capitalist achievement, and I could substitute the word innovation here, the innovation achievement does not typically consist in providing more silk stockings for queens, but in bringing them within the reach of factory girls. It's making things available to everybody that is so fulfilling the needs, meeting people's desires and needs. It's not an innovation of any significance if it doesn't actually meet a need. Innovation requires trial and error. This is a big theme of my book and of my understanding of innovation. Again and again, I found that great innovators talked about the importance of trial and error. Here's Thomas Edison saying, I have not failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work. Art Fry of the Post-it note, there are lots of other people on record as saying, no, what counts was not me being clever, but me trying lots of things, most of which failed. And Jeff Bezos makes similar remarks about the development of Amazon. The importance was swinging and missing, and occasionally, if you're lucky, hitting. Innovation is not a question of individual geniuses shutting themselves away in ivory towers and coming up with bright ideas. It is very much a collaborative process. It's a team sport. Dwarf wheat, which is the variety of wheat that resulted in the Green Revolution in India and Pakistan, dramatically increasing wheat harvest yields and basically banishing famine from the subcontinent pretty well forever in the 1960s and 70s, came about as a result of a work of a brilliant man named Norman Borlaug. But when you look closely, Borlaug got the idea of these dwarf varieties, which might be able to respond to heavier fertilizer applications better with higher yields without falling over. He got that idea from a guy called Burton Bales, who he met at a conference in Argentina. Bales had got it from Orville Vogel, who was growing these dwarf wheats in Oregon. Vogel had got it from a guy called Cecil Salmon, who was on Douglas MacArthur's staff at the end of the war in Japan, where he went to an agricultural station and saw the experiments of a man named Gonjiro Inuzuka, who had been crossing different varieties of wheat to bring these dwarf genes into the crop. And we don't know where Gonjiro Inuzuka got the idea. That is lost in the mist of time. But the point is that this is not, it's, yes, Norman Borlaug was a brilliant and important individual, but you have to understand his predecessors and you have to understand his successors too. So he passed the idea on to M.S. Swaminathan, a brilliant Indian geneticist and politician who made a big difference by persuading his country to adopt this technology. So that's what innovations typically look like. And we tend to pull out one guy and give him a prize or a biography rather than seeing it as the network effect it is. There's something strangely inevitable about innovation once it gets going. 21 different people had the same idea of the light bulb independently in the 1870s. There was Swan in England, there was Edison in America, and Lodygin in Russia, and so on and so forth. And this is true of most innovations, that there's a bunch of people claiming simultaneous invention. They often get very cross with each other, take each other to court. Think of Darwin and Wallace with evolution. It happens all the time. It's more common than not. So how can this be? Why is it that everybody's thinking of a light bulb at the same time? And the answer is because the contributing technologies to making electric light bulbs work, that is to say, electricity, the use of electricity for lighting in arc lighting, the vacuum pump for making a vacuum, the glass blowing industry, these had all reached a point where it was inevitable people would try and put it together. And if Edison had not lived, we would still have light bulbs. The same is true in the 1990s of search engines. Lots of people had ideas for search engines. If Google had not been brought into existence, we would still have search engines. And indeed, we do have lots of other alternative search engines. It was inevitable that search engines would be invented as soon as the internet got to a certain point of development. And yet, bizarrely, nobody sees the search engine coming. Even Sergey Brin and Larry Page didn't think they were inventing a search engine. And nobody back in the 80s or 70s said, you know what, once we get computers networked, there's going to be a real role, in fact, probably a very lucrative role for a program that helps you find things on the internet. Very few people say that. And if they do say it, they say it very obscurely and don't make much fuss about it. And certainly nobody sees it as a commercial opportunity. And yet, even Page and Brin, as I say, didn't really think that that's what they were doing. And so just to remind you how strangely unpredictable innovation is when you're looking forward, even though it looks very obvious when you're looking backward, here are 4 quotations from very clever people saying very stupid things about the future. Ernest Rutherford, 1933, anyone who expects a source of power from the transformation of the atom is talking moonshine. Ken Olsen, the chairman of the Digital Equipment Corporation, which made the smallest computers in those days and much the most successful computer company in the 1970s, says there's no reason anyone would want a computer in their own home. We'll make small ones. We won't make them that small. That's ridiculous. Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, speaking in 1998, says by 2005 or so, it'll become clear that the internet's impact on the economy will have been no greater than the fax machines. And Steve Ballmer, the chief executive of Microsoft, in 2007, there's no chance the iPhone is going to get significant market share, no chance. Well, while we're on the subject of forecasting and prediction, I think it's really interesting to see what our grandparents thought the future would look like. This is a cartoon from when I was born, and it shows a US mailman delivering old-fashioned letters, but by rocket. So he's jumping from house to house with a rocket in order to hand out old-fashioned letters. So they haven't seen email coming, but they have expected changes in transportation that did not happen. And this is a characteristic of the 1950s. They think the future is going to be all about incredible changes in transport, because the past had, up until that point, for the last 50 years, been all about incredible changes in transport. The first motor cars, the first airplanes, supersonic travel eventually, space travel, and so on. And in fact, the last 50 years have seen almost no changes in transport, but they've seen incredible changes in computers and communication, which most people didn't see coming because there hadn't been much change in computers and communication in the first half of the 20th century. Not everybody got everything wrong. Here's a wonderful picture from Germany in the 1930s of how we would spend our days in the 2000s. And it's wonderfully antique, but it's also not entirely wrong. Now, I talk about hype cycles, and what I mean by that is the fact that we underestimate the impact of a new technology in the long run, but we overestimate it in the short run. This is a remark made by a guy called Roy Amara, who was a computer scientist in Silicon Valley in the 1960s. And I think it's a very profound insight, actually, because most technologies go through a cycle. They don't show linear progression. They show something much more S-like, where they disappoint for many years and then they suddenly take off and reach saturation. So the internet, I think it's safe to say, is not disappointing anymore, despite what Paul Krugman thinks. The genomics revolution has been disappointing up until now in the 20 years since the sequencing of the human genome, but it's now reached the point where it is delivering pretty spectacular results. A lot of modern artificial intelligence, you know, the self-driving cars, etc., I think they're still going to be disappointing for a while. I don't think we're quite ready for takeoff in a lot of this stuff. And as for blockchain and crypto and Bitcoin and that kind of stuff, I suspect it hasn't begun to disappoint us yet, but that doesn't mean that in 15 years' time, some of you young guys are not going to be making gigantic fortunes out of moving markets into the cloud through blockchain technologies. Empires are bad at innovation. This is an argument I want to make because I think it's true. The Arabian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Ming Empire in China, the Roman Empire, these are not periods of great innovative ferment. Why? Because they're too centralized, because they tend to impose one-size-fits-all rules from the center. What does that remind you of today? If in my case, it reminds me of the European Union, which is intent on not encouraging differences between geographical areas in the way they regulate or encourage technologies, but is insistent on the rules being exactly the same everywhere, and harmonization. And that is why, in my view, the European Union has proved to be very bad at innovation, why it has rejected things like biotechnology, why it is falling sharply behind on genome editing, and why it has produced no digital giants to rival Amazon, Google, or their Chinese equivalents. So what does work is breaking up empires into city-states or smaller countries with different regimes, particularly if they find a way of living in peaceful and cooperative trading relationships with each other, like the states of North America do. And I don't know if you noticed, but just last week, Elon Musk was threatening to move Tesla from California to Texas because he didn't like the way California was handling the lockdown and various other issues. That's exactly what innovators do, is they move from one regime to another till they find a congenial one. That was the secret of Europe in its period of most innovation, was that it was split up into different countries, and people like Gutenberg would move from one town and country to another till they found somewhere where they could pursue their innovation. The same is true of big companies. They tend to get taken by surprise by innovations which come from outside them. Kodak was completely destroyed by the development of digital photography, despite having invented it itself. I mean, it did produce a prototype digital camera, but decided A, that it was never going to be much good, and B, that it was too much of a threat to its film business, so it didn't really want to go down that alley. Nokia became the biggest mobile phone company in the world in the 1990s, hugely successful, but based entirely around voice. And when the idea of data phones and smartphones came along, it did not want to go down that route because it would end up cannibalizing its voice products. And so it hesitated to do so, and it crashed and burned and became a very small company and was bought out by one of its rivals. Innovation is an evolutionary process. By this, well, let me show you what I mean by a quote from a philosopher by the name of Alain. His real name was Émile Chartier. He said, "Every boat is copied from another boat. Let's reason as follows in the manner of Darwin. It is clear that a very badly made boat will end up at the bottom after 1 or 2 voyages and thus never be copied. One could then say with complete rigor that it is the sea herself who fashions the boats, choosing those which function and destroying the others." So when you go on an airplane, you think, well, somebody's designed this. It's the product of intelligent design. Or when you cross a bridge, you think it's been intelligently designed. But actually, when you think about it, the bridge or the plane were not built from scratch without any thought as to precedents. They were copied from previous designs with modifications, and those designs were copied from previous designs and so on. It's a process of descent with modification that goes all the way back to the first bridge or the first aeroplane. And we can see descent with modification in the technologies that we use every day around us today. Is the evolution of the mobile phone. It's interesting how for a long time it got smaller and then it started getting bigger again in more recent years. One of the consequences of this, and this I think is relevant to liberty and freedom, is that we come up with things that are the result of human action, but not the execution of any human design. Now, what did Adam Ferguson mean by this phrase in the 1760s? He meant things like the English language, which is a man-made thing. It's not a natural phenomenon like a rock, but it's not the product of any one individual. It's not run by a chief executive. There is no central committee of the English language. It evolves under its own steam. The same is true when you think about it for the internet. It's ridiculous to think of it as ordained from above. And this is where I think the concept of spontaneous order is terribly important and that most people don't get. They assume that for there to be order, there must be a designer, an orderer, a boss, a president. And they look to government to solve their problems as a result. Technology is the seed of science as well as the fruit. Let me illustrate this point by telling you the story of genome editing, in particular the CRISPR technology, which is the brand new technology for very precise editing of genomes, which comes out of the academic departments of Harvard and Berkeley and places like that. At least that's what it looks like. But when you look more closely, you find that those academics who developed it actually got the idea from the yogurt industry. The yogurt industry is worried about its bacteria getting sick, so it employs bacteriologists to study bacterial illness from viruses, and these people had basically stumbled upon the immune system of the bacteria, which turned out to have a very precise mechanism in it for recognizing genome sequences, which could be then repowered for use in medicine and agriculture. So it's not a case that this starts with science and ends up with industry. It starts with industry, it then goes to science, and then it comes back to industry later. It's very clear to me from history that the threat of innovation to employment is a myth. Innovation doesn't destroy jobs. It does reduce the amount of time you have to spend working in your life so that you can have a long period of education and retirement. You can have long weekends. You can have 8-hour days, things that our ancestors did not have. But we have automated almost everything in agriculture, most things in manufacturing, and we have increased the number of jobs on the planet rather than decreased them. And that will continue to be the case. Even if AI turns replaces lawyers with robots. Lawyers and professionals are getting very worked up about that at the moment in a way they didn't get worked up about previous waves of automation, curiously. But it will not result in the loss of jobs. Because just think of all the professions that are done today that you would struggle to explain even what they mean to a Victorian entrepreneur. What is a flight attendant? What is a software engineer, etc. Innovation enables us to do more with less. This is a very important point. We are actually experiencing a reduction in the material needs of the British economy at the moment. This is a surprising fact. Even as our population continues to grow and our GDP continues to grow, we need less land to produce a given amount of food. We need less metal to produce a given amount of building or vehicles. In all sorts of ways, we're actually importing and mining less stuff. Not just less per head, but less overall. This is true of America too. It's a really interesting fact about the modern world. And it gives the lie to those who say infinite growth is impossible in a finite world, something David Attenborough is fond of saying, for example. And yes, you can sort of immediately think why that must be true. But then when you think about it, if growth consists of doing more with less, then there's no reason we can't just find a way of using fewer and fewer resources as we grow more and more. Innovation flourishes in freedom. Throughout history, people have opposed innovation and they have used the power of the law and the power of rulers to oppose it. On the left is a proclamation by King Charles II about banning coffee. And he thinks coffee is a bad idea because it might lead to people meeting in coffee houses and talking about what a bad job the king is doing, and that must not be allowed. The umbrella was opposed by the hansom cab industry. The margarine was banned in many American states because of lobbying by the butter industry. So there is huge opposition to innovation whenever it happens. And quite often, the opponents of innovation get power and manage to suppress it. And that's why it's terribly important that there is permissive freedom for innovators to go out there and do their innovation. One of the reasons we have seen so much digital innovation in the last 20 years and so little in other areas is because of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act passed by President Clinton's administration, which effectively was a very, very permissive and libertarian act that unleashed e-commerce by making businesses that wish to sell things or publish things on the internet into platforms, not publishers. Now, I could stop there. I shall just quickly rattle through some reminders of how, as a result of these trends in innovation, the world is getting better, unless you show in some means by interrupting me that you'd like me to stop there and go straight to questions. But I've got about 10 more slides that I could show you otherwise very quickly. Why don't I just show a couple of them anyway? Here's a fact about the world that most people don't know. If you ask people in the street, has the percentage of the world population that lives in extreme poverty doubled, halved, or stayed the same over the past 20 years? Most people will say it has doubled. 65% of people in Britain and America say the percentage of the world population living in extreme poverty has doubled in 20 years. Only about 5% know the right answer, which is that it is halved. That's shocking enough. But Hans Rosling, who did this experiment, then thought, well, hang on, if I wrote those three answers on 3 bananas and threw them to a monkey in a cage, the monkey would get the right answer 33% of the time, not 5% of the time. So it would do 6 times as well as human beings in answering a question about human society. How can that possibly be? And the answer is that it's because it's not what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that ain't so. So there is a huge blockage to our understanding of the world caused by the fact that the media has told people that things are getting worse incessantly, to the point where they know it to be true, even though it's not true. Here's the data on world poverty, plummeting in my lifetime. This has never happened on this scale before. Here's child mortality. In contrast to what I was told when I was young, that the outlook was desperate for mankind, this has been the best 50 years in the history of mankind. Here's what we were expecting about malaria. It was going up in the 1990s. It was going to get worse and worse, particularly because of climate change. In fact, malaria mortality has sharply declined in this century, thanks to an innovation, mainly the insecticide-treated bed net. Here's what's happened to famine. We were told that famine was going to get much worse in the 70s and 80s and 90s as we approached carrying capacity of the planet. In fact, famine went extinct. It's almost impossible to die of famine these days. That is extraordinary. It's never been true of history before. Here's what's happened to population. It was growing at 2% when I was young. It's 1% today. It's heading for flattening out. Here's what's happening to warfare. We are living through an age of unprecedented peace. A little bit of a tick up in recent years caused by the war in Syria, but compared with what was routine in the past, hardly any war going on. Here's what's happened to the cleanliness of the ocean. When I was young, oil spills were a frequent and devastating occurrence. They now hardly ever happen, thanks to double-hulled tankers, GPS navigation, and so on. When I was young, there were 5,000 humpback whales left in the world, and I assumed they would be extinct before I was an adult. They were getting rarer and rarer at such a rapid rate because of exploitation. Now there are 80,000 humpback whales in the world. And that's true of most other whale species. And you're now seeing aggregations of whales in vast numbers, like this one off the coast of Southwest Africa, that have not been seen for generations. What about climate? Isn't that getting worse? No, not yet. The percentage of the world in drought has been declining slightly, not increasing. The frequency and severity of tropical cyclones, storms, hurricanes, and so on has not changed in any consistent direction. The level of the sea is rising, but not at an accelerating rate, at about 1 foot per century, which is not much different from the rate at which it rose in the 20th century. Here's what's happening to the green vegetation on the planet. It is increasing. It's increased by about 15% in the last 30 years, or at least that's what I'd been saying up until last week. But last week, a new paper appeared saying that even this might be an underestimate and that it might have increased at twice that rate. And this is data from satellites confirming that we're getting more green vegetation on the planet every year. Why? Well, because carbon dioxide is a fertilizer of plant growth. That's why, and there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Here's what's happened to inequality. In 1970, when I was young, there was a chasm between the rich world and the poor world, the first world and the third world, as we called them. Today, there is a mountain in the middle. Most people in the poor countries have moved into middle-income countries, and most people in rich countries haven't shifted very much in the direction of even greater wealth. People are happier when they are richer. That is true between countries and within countries, as this data shows. But even these kind of trends underestimate what's happening because they underestimate the impact of innovation on technology. This is what has happened to the price of lighting over many centuries. It has gone from being a luxury to a necessity. And if you measure it in terms of the time taken to earn the money to buy the light, the change is even more spectacular. It took you 6 hours in 1800 to earn enough money to buy as much light as you could get for a third of a second's work today. So your generation lives at a time of unprecedented prosperity. I have lived through more than half a century of truly unprecedented human improvement and betterment. Throughout that time, I have been told that this is a terrible time to be alive and it's about to get much worse. that even if things got better in the past, they're bound to get worse. And that's what people told Thomas and Babington Macaulay in 1832, and he didn't believe it then. He said things might get better, and they had hardly started getting better, and he was right. There was great opportunities to get better. So with that, I'll stop and take your questions.
Well, thank you ever so much, Matt. That was a brilliant presentation. It always makes me feel so much better about myself reading your articles and hearing you talk. So I'd give you a round of applause for everyone it is at the moment. So thank you very much. As you said, best time to be alive. And I'd have to say thank you, because you're one of the people who really does make everyone, try so much harder and, try and really be entrepreneurial for these reasons. In fact, we had a comment on Facebook from Sergey McCullough saying, I've read all your books, very wonderful. You've changed my outlook on humankind, and I can't wait to read your next one. So that's
great.
It's
well, if enough people say things like that on Facebook, I might get onto the bestseller list this week. The book comes out in the US tomorrow. It comes out in the UK at the end of June, with a special afterword about the pandemic written for the UK edition.
Fantastic. I've just put the HarperCollins link in the web chat, so everyone can go and buy the book, which I would absolutely recommend.
Thank you, Max. You're very kind to let me do a bit of salesmanship.
Oh, of course, of course. Also, please do read Matt Ridley's contributions to The Spectator and sign up for his blog and everything. So without further ado, I think we should get on to questions. And I'm going to start with my own. As being host, it gives me that privilege. You say in your book, innovation requires interdependence, and you've hinted at it in your presentation as well. A lot of people, including Kate Andrews from The Spectator, have said maybe globalization's in trouble, and obviously innovation requires globalization, especially at such an unprecedented time. So with the death of globalization potentially coming, I'm sure you'll disagree with it. Do you think now innovation is even more under threat, as you hinted towards the end of your book?
Well, I think there is no doubt that if the world turns its back on globalized trade, it will be bad for innovation. Just think, for example, about imagine Oxford does develop a working vaccine in September and nobody else does. Are we really saying that we don't want Americans or Africans or French people or Chinese people to have access to that vaccine? Because that's what we mean when we say we don't like global trade, that you can't get access to the best technologies and the best ideas just because they happen to be developed in a different country. I live in a small village in northeast England. On the whole, nobody in my village objects if I buy something that is made in another town or another village, because there aren't very many things made in my village. Why should it be different from any country? That's the argument for free trade. Now, will there be a collapse of global trade in the wake of this? I hope not. I hope we're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But there is a bit of bathwater we need to throw out, and that is the tendency to export diseases around the world, both human ones and animal and plant ones. And I am not a believer in free trade in unhealthy things. And therefore, it is quite right, for example, to restrict trade in animals and plants around the world. And one of the causes of this pandemic was the wildlife trade in China, we think. So I would like to see some reform to things like that. Do I think we are too dependent on China for things like personal protective equipment in the health system? Well, I think we're not well prepared in that respect, and we haven't done a good enough job of stockpiling, but I don't think that's the same as saying we're not going to get it from China.
Well, fair enough. Very good. I always thought it was quite ironic that we spent so long dissing, single-use plastics, and now we can't get enough of them for PPE. So.
That is a very good point.
I'm going to take some questions from the audience from the Q&A box. I can't do all of them because we're a little bit short on time, but that's no problem. Gillian McCullough Same said, what do you think of Mazzucato's, obviously Professor Mazzucato from UCL Economics, who came up with this idea of the entrepreneurial state? She said, states innovate by sticking subsidies or war or all of these sort of ideas, and she thought only really the entrepreneurial state exists to profit off this. So can you give us your idea of that?
Yes, I have a section of the book in which I'm critical of her argument, constructively so, because I think although it's true that governments pay for some innovation, I think it's a complete misreading of history to think that that is planned innovation by government, and that we therefore need to do more of this central planning of innovation. And I think it also underestimates the distinction between the inventor and the innovator, between the beaver and the builder of the Hoover Dam. So, for example, the idea that government invented the internet, so deserves the credit for it. Well, it's true that some of the early stuff done on computer networking was done within DARPA, but then, DARPA was using privately developed technologies to do it. And a lot of the DARPA people left and went to develop this in the private sector. At what point do you credit government rather than the private sector? And I think she cites a particular, I think it may be touchscreens or plasma screens or something that came out of a publicly funded PhD, arguably. Well, it did and it didn't. That was one PhD that contributed. And yes, it was a public grant, but it was not a public grant saying, please go and develop a touchscreen. That's the point. It wasn't goal directed. It was, here's a grant for doing some interesting research. Oh my goodness, you've come up with something useful. I mean, in the book, I cite the case that the Jet Propulsion Laboratory published a list of all the things that had come out of the space program, saying, if it wasn't for the space program, we wouldn't have, plastic, metal, Teflon, This ridiculous list of things that it claims would not have been invented without the Apollo program. And this is just wrong. I mean, Teflon, for a start, was invented before the Apollo program, was adapted to the Apollo program. And the idea that we wouldn't have these kind of things if it weren't for that. Another example is warfare. People think warfare is vital to the development of antibiotics and computers and things like that. Actually, I don't think that's the case. If you look at the story of the computer, the key developments happen in the 1930s, and a whole bunch of people start working on projects, and then they disappear into secret silos in the war where they can't talk to each other, and where all they're doing is calculating the trajectory of artillery shells or decrypting German messages, not trying to be general purpose, and they have to wait till the war's over before they can bring these. Johnny von Neumann brings them together and says, let's have the electronic ideas from the ENIAC, and let's have the stored program idea from the Mark I, and so on, and they all come together and it starts again. Something similar with antibiotics. The Oxford team that developed Fleming's idea into a practical medication put in their application to the Wellcome Foundation for funding in September 1939, the day before war broke out. And they didn't get as much money as they wanted because war had broken out. So I wouldn't make the same argument for the Manhattan Project. I think we would not have developed nuclear weapons in the 1940s if there wasn't for a war. And I don't think you can imagine that project happening in the private sector. But then that's hardly an example to thrill our bones.
No, you're absolutely right. I was going to say, necessity is the father of innovation, but that seems to be, you seem to counter that quite a lot, which is good to see in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think if necessity was the mother of invention, then Zimbabwe would have invented more software than California.
Very good point. An anonymous attendee has said, could you see any threats to innovation from current political climates with the rise of populism, Greta Thunberg, especially as they gain popularity against sort of the younger generation? Is this populist rise against innovation, as you touched on in your book and in your presentation, is that a new 21st century problem?
Yes, I think it's a huge problem. I don't think it's just a 21st century problem. I think there's always been opposition to innovation, but it's finding new ways of getting its message across. There is an enormously well-funded environmental movement, which is fundamentally against innovation, whatever it says. and which adheres to the precautionary principle, which in its extreme form, it basically says don't do anything for the first time, don't do anything new, because you must weigh the risks of doing something new, but you cannot weigh the benefits of doing something new, and you cannot weigh the benefits of not doing something old that's dangerous. So it's completely asymmetrical in the way that it's applied, particularly within the European Union. And this kind of precautionary approach in which we worry about what might go wrong if we innovate, and we don't think about what might go right if we innovate, is hugely popular in the environmental movement, but also on the populist right, and among younger people generally. So I do fear that we are going to experience an innovation famine rather than an innovation feast. Look at how little innovation we have been able to do in vaccine development or in DNA diagnostics compared with what we would like to have done at this stage in the pandemic. And that's because we have worried so much about the risks of some of these technologies, including the vaccine risk. Remember, on the populist right, there is huge anti-vaxxer popularity, that we have slowed down innovation by making the regulation very onerous.
Well, yes, it is quite concerning in that sort of sense. Alexis de Vienne has asked the question, what can the British government do to improve innovation now that it will leave the European Union? Well, hopefully it leaves the European Union. You and I are both Brexiteers, so let's see what happens.
We have left the European Union.
Oh,
it's just
true.
a matter
Well,
of,
yes.
just a matter of making, ironing out the details. There are lots of practical things we can do. We can switch immediately overnight to the International Cartagena Protocol definition of what a genetically modified organism is, for example, which the European Union refuses to adhere to. That would exempt nearly all gene-edited organisms and would unleash a torrent of innovation in agriculture and plant breeding. And it would be extremely safe technologies. We know that from examples elsewhere in the world. We can begin to catch up with America and China in that technology. So there are some very specific things we can do in that respect. We can, in my view, dismantle a lot of the extremely slow decision-making by regulators that deters innovation. I'm particularly obsessed by this. I think what deters innovators is not so much regulators saying no. They never did say no to fracking or genetically modified organisms. They just took so long to say yes that they ensured that the entrepreneurs went bust before they gave their final decision. I caricature it, but that's roughly what happened. So we can speed up decision making. We can also, I think, rejig some of the ways we reward innovators. I make the case in the book that the patent system is particularly hindering innovation these days. It's not helping it, and it's tending to create monopolies that get in the way of further innovation, and rewarding people rather than rewarding people for defending what they've discovered rather than for discovering something new. I wrote about this at the weekend, and I got an immediate reply from someone in California saying this is exactly right, this is exactly what's happening. In the fields where it works, we don't worry about patenting, we just move on to get the next thing so as to try and stay ahead of our competitors. And so how would you do that? Well, you could buy out patents. You could go along to the 3D patents expired a few years ago. That has resulted in a huge burst of new innovation in 3D printing. Sorry, 3D printing, I meant to say. So if we bought out patents prematurely before they'd expired, then we could create those kind of bursts of innovation. I think we'd be better off buying out patents than granting subsidies to technologies that government thinks it likes. Because the problem with subsidies is that governments think they're picking winners, but losers are good at picking governments. And the subsidies we've given, for example, to novel forms of wind power have only increased the cost of electricity pretty dramatically, and have increased the devastation of the landscape for very little gain in terms of decarbonisation.
Oh, yeah, it's very good. I agree. I mean, I've visited Northumberlandia, for example, on your estate, so I know the beauty
Good
of.
Man.
If anyone ever goes to Northumberland, go to Northumberlandia. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous.
Thank you. The
monument
Lady
to
of the
nature.
North. She's a
Lady of the North.
she's an innovation I was involved with, designed by Charles Jenks. She's the biggest woman in the world, a third of a mile long.
Everyone should go, definitely. It's my grandparents are in Washington, so I regularly visit up to the northeast.
Great.
Yes.
Well, next time you go, let me know, and we'll meet for a picnic there.
Oh, well, I will take you up on that, absolutely. I think this is going to have to start coming to a close. You're so busy today, Matt, doing all of your publicity and book launching stuff. Can you spare any more time, or
how about sort of 2 or 3 more minutes?
2 or 3 more minutes. Well, in that case, I'll kind of wrap it up in that case and just say, why should young libertarians buy your book?
Firstly, because they'll enjoy it, and secondly, because it'll give them clues as to how to get rich, and thirdly, if they get rich, they'll be able to spend their fortunes on doing great, good things in the book. I end the book with well, no, I don't, but in the middle of the book, I have an example of an innovation that has not made a penny for anybody, that isn't high tech, but has saved millions of lives. It's the insecticide impregnated mosquito net, taken up by the Gates Foundation, etc. And that's just a lovely example, I think, to remind people that we're not in the game of making a fortune. We're not in the game of using up resources. We're in the game of helping people's lives. And that can be done with surprisingly simple new ideas. And there are lots more ideas out there. So please go out and discover things and invent things, because that's how the world gets better.
Absolutely agree. Well, in that case, I think we'll wrap it up there. Matt Ridley, it has been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you ever so much for spending time with us. And everyone, please buy How Innovation Works. Anyway, well, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Max. And I apologize for being a tiny bit late, but I got there in the end.
No problem at all. I'll end the stream here. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.